What's going on, everyone? This is Ryan Ecker with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the VO2 Max podcast. If this is your first time listening, then I hope you enjoy today's episode. I think today's episode is going to be a good one, especially considering that, at least for most of the listeners of this show that are potentially in the US or in the Northern Hemisphere, we're in the middle of summer right now, and so talking about fueling or evidence-based fueling guidelines or recommendations during endurance activity couldn't be any more relevant, given how important it is, not only as the distance of endurance events gets longer, but also as the conditions get more extreme, particularly in terms of heat and humidity, which we experience in the summer. So this episode should be pretty relevant to anyone listening, especially now that we are in the middle of summer, and especially if you are an endurance athlete that partakes in events that are longer than an hour to 90 minutes. Talking about fueling and especially trying to hone in your specific fueling strategy for events that you're competing in that are longer than 90 minutes is absolutely critical for performance. And it just becomes that much more important the longer that the event gets. So like for events such as, say, 70.3 distance triathlons or full distance Ironman triathlons, ultra marathons, even things maybe potentially as short as a marathon that are, 2.5, 3.5, 4+ hours, fueling for those events becomes absolutely critical for performance. And so the point of this episode is to not necessarily talk about a specific fueling strategy using particular products or specific brand names of products, because there's a million different ways that you could conceivably come up with an appropriate fueling strategy during endurance activity, just because there are so many different ways of fueling. For example, just in terms of getting in carbohydrates, you could get in carbohydrates from fruit like bananas or dried fruits. You could get it in from bars, from any different kind of brand sports-related brand that's out there. You could take it in via gels, via sports gummies, via liquids, and amongst those different types of fuels, there's obviously an endless number of different brands that you could choose from. And everyone kind of responds differently and has different preferences to certain brands or to certain ways of getting in their fueling. And so this episode is not necessarily to discuss a specific type of product, a specific way of getting in carbohydrates, fluids, electrolytes. It's more to discuss the evidence-based guidelines that we have that should inform general fueling strategies for training and racing for endurance athletes. And so keep in mind that also by evidence-based, I mean that the majority of the evidence that we have up to this point has informed these recommendations. So these aren't just recommendations that I'm, pulling out of the back of my hat or that are solely based on just experience on my end. They're based on the evidence and the best available evidence that we have right now. So keep that in mind as I go throughout this podcast and have this discussion, is that these are generalized evidence-based sports nutrition recommendations, and I'm specifically going to focus on fueling during training and racing. I'll talk very briefly about fueling before and immediately after, but the goal of this podcast is to focus primarily on fueling surrounding training and racing, or just endurance activity in general, not necessarily to talk about all different aspects of sports nutrition throughout the 24-hour day. So we'll push to the side, carbohydrate, fat, and protein intake throughout the day, how much, fluid should an athlete be consuming throughout the day. We won't even begin to talk about supplements or other areas like that. This is purely to focus on fueling during endurance activity, and we'll touch on a little bit what do you do just before exercise, and then what do you do just after exercise. And again, it's all evidence-based guidelines based on the evidence that we have to this point. So let's dive right in. Before I talk about the specific guidelines on like certain quantities or amounts of things such as electrolytes, fluids, and carbohydrates, we need to talk about first, what is the general goal of fueling during endurance activity? So for endurance activities or events that last less than probably 60 to 90 minutes or so, this isn't entirely relevant because you're not necessarily going to run out of or deplete yourself of fluids or electrolytes or carbohydrates to the point where it's going to impair performance. But when you're participating in an activity, especially if it's a race that's longer than 90 minutes, now we get into the kind of duration of time where fueling becomes that much more important. And there are three particular areas of concern when we're looking to optimize fueling during endurance activity. And these three things are the most important kind of pieces of the puzzle to get right when it comes to fueling. So when it comes to endurance activity and fueling during exercise, protein isn't really necessary. Fat isn't really necessary. Other things like antioxidants or other potential supplements and vitamins and minerals aren't necessary. The three things that are really necessary to fuel and to optimize performance during endurance activity breaks down into overall fluids and hydration, electrolytes, particularly sodium, although other electrolytes are important, but sodium tends to be the most important one, and then carbohydrates. And those are the three things that you want to make sure that you as an individual get right when it comes to fueling and optimizing your performance during endurance activities that are longer than 60 to 90 minutes. So if it's less than 60 to 90 minutes, let's say you're doing like a 5K race, fueling is basically irrelevant. The only thing that really matters is how you're fueling leading up to the race. But then once you get into the race, for most people, a 5K is going to be well under an hour, well under 30 minutes for a lot of people, and fueling is completely irrelevant. Same thing for other shorter events too. So something like a 10K, for some people, it might take less than an hour or it might take a little over an hour. Fueling becomes very, very unimportant for that event as well. The only time that kind of fueling might become important for certain events that are like around that 45 to 60 to 75 minute range would be if you're doing a really intense event in really warm conditions, and it's less so the fueling, it's more so keeping cool. And so things like drinking a little bit of water or dumping water on yourself during short events that are taking place in really hot conditions might become important. But for the most part, regardless of what type of event it is, if it's less than 60 minutes, pretty safe to say that fueling is very unimportant for that type of event. So most road running or trail running races that are 10K or less, for triathlons, if there are certain events called like super sprint distance events that might be 30, 40, 45 minutes. For those types of events, fueling becomes very unimportant. For some people, potentially, depending on how fast they're doing something like a sprint distance, like a standard sprint distance triathlon, it might take them only 55 minutes to an hour 10. Fueling isn't very important. Maybe having sips of water throughout, just kind of sipping to thirst. Maybe having some carbohydrates at the beginning of the run, just in case. You could do something like that, but for the most part, events that are less than 90 minutes, for you as an individual, you really don't need to be worried too much about fueling. So most of this discussion is focusing on durations of events that are longer than 90 minutes. And now, like I said, the three most important areas of concern: fluids, electrolytes, and carbohydrates. Let's start with fluids. So we know that typically, based on what the research suggests, and there's a little bit of controversy on some of these topics as well, but I'm going to be talking about what like the majority of research says, and what's typically accepted as best practice. So when it comes to fluids, we know that a loss of body weight due to fluid loss of 2 to 3%, we can start to see some decrements in performance. And so usually the goal when it comes to fluid intake is to minimize body weight loss, not necessarily negate body weight loss, because it's going to be almost impossible, especially for extremely long endurance events, to not lose any weight. Although it is possible, but the goal usually isn't to lose no weight at all, or to lose some fluids. The goal is to minimize that loss, to be as little as possible. And so if you could keep so for example, let's just say we have a 150-pound endurance athlete, a 2% reduction in body weight due to fluid loss would be 3 pounds, right? So 1% is 1.5 pounds. So a 150-pound endurance athlete who partakes in, let's say, an Ironman, and they get done with their Ironman. Let's say they weigh themselves right before the event and they're 151 pounds, and then at the end of the event they're 147 pounds or 148 pounds. They're right around that kind of 2.5%, 3% body weight loss range, which wouldn't be too bad. So right, that kind of loss due to fluids might not impair performance too much. But now let's say we have that same 150 pound endurance athlete. They weighed 150 pounds at the start of the event, and then at the end of the event, they're 140. Now that's a pretty significant loss of body weight, probably mostly due to fluids, although there is going to be some loss due to carbohydrate and glycogen stores. But for the most part, it's going to be water or fluids. Now 10 pounds would obviously be way over that kind of 2 to 3% threshold where you would expect to start to see some kind of reduction in performance. And so if they performed really poorly in that event and they lost that much weight, then they know that their hydration strategies probably weren't optimal to promote good performance. And so typically when it comes to fluids, the reason that you want to keep your fluid stores or your hydration stores topped up, so to speak, is because one, water is extremely important to help us cool ourselves down via sweating. So obviously the less fluids we have within us, the less efficient we're going to be at dissipating heat via sweat. So it starts to impair our ability to cool ourselves. And then another reason that it's important to have our fluids topped up again, so to speak, is because it helps keep our blood plasma volume topped up, if for lack of a better phrase. So as you start to become more and more dehydrated, you start to lose some fluid in your blood plasma, or the blood that's constantly flowing throughout your system. And as you lose volume in your blood, it can decrease your cardiac output. So in other words, you'll have your heart rate, and you'll have noticed this before if you've ever gotten dehydrated on a really warm day, your heart rate tends to creep higher and higher and higher the more dehydrated you get. And that's because with each contraction or beat of the heart, your body's not able to produce quite as much volume of blood that's being ejected from the left ventricle. And so in order to keep up with the demands of the activity, your heart has to beat quicker, i.e. faster heart rate, so that it can keep up. And then along with that obviously comes an increased perceived effort, and usually performance will start to decline as well at some point. So couple reasons why it's important to keep fluid intake topped up for cooling and then for cardiac output reasons, so that you minimize that cardiac drift or the rise in heart rate that you would typically see if you started to get really dehydrated. So that was fluids. Now let's move on to electrolytes. Second important category. So when it comes to electrolytes, we lose electrolytes when we sweat. Particularly sodium is the one that we're primarily concerned with. And the reason that maintaining adequate electrolyte intake throughout exercise, the reason that is important is because the more sodium that we lose via sweat during exercise, the lower that our sodium concentration becomes in the blood. Now there's a balance between sodium within the cells and sodium outside of the cells or in the blood or in the extracellular fluid space kind of surrounding cells. And water normally follows sodium in this case, among other electrolytes. But in this particular case, where we're talking just about sodium for the time being, water will follow sodium. And so usually there's a delicate balance maintained from within the cells and outside of the cells of sodium. And as you lose more and more sodium through sweat loss during exercise, the amount of sodium outside of the cells and in the blood becomes less and less. And so fluids or water will then rush to the inside of the cells as that balance starts to become more and more extreme to where there's way more sodium in the cells than there is outside of the cells. And so you'll start to lose fluid in the blood and it will go inside of the cells. And this can create a host of issues once that kind of delicate balance is thrown off kilter. And so in the most severe cases of not taking in enough electrolytes and drinking too much water alone, hyponatremia is usually the most severe consequence of that. And obviously that can be potentially life-threatening if it goes too far. And so it's usually why generally you'll see especially for prolonged endurance events, that it's not recommended to just drink straight water alone by itself, or at least not for very long. It's okay to obviously be drinking some water or have sips of just straight plain water, but usually it's recommended to take in electrolytes with fluids, just to make sure that you're getting enough fluids in, but also enough electrolytes in, because if you're not taking in enough electrolytes, you're not going to be able to retain and hold on to that water that you're taking in, or the fluids that you're taking in. So we have hydration and electrolytes, and then the third piece of the puzzle is carbohydrates. And obviously we need carbohydrates because that's going to be one of the primary sources of fuel for that endurance activity that you're doing. Obviously, carbohydrates and fat are the two primary sources of fuel that the body's going to rely upon for endurance activity, but we have essentially an unlimited amount of fat stores to draw upon. Even if you're an incredibly lean endurance athlete who has a really low body fat percentage, you have enough fat to go for days and days and days. And so there's no need to fuel with fat during exercise because you have plenty of it. But carbohydrate stores are extremely limited. So we store carbohydrate in the form of glycogen in the liver and in the muscle, and we have a limited amount of glycogen stores that can last a few hours of intense exercise, let's say. And so there is the very real possibility of running out of carbohydrate stores, especially during prolonged endurance activity that are, over 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. If you don't take in any carbohydrates during activity, there is the very real possibility that you will essentially run out. And this leads to that dreaded bonking experience that maybe some athletes or some of you have experienced before. You can obviously bonk without completely running out of carbohydrates. Usually that bonking sensation is just due to low blood glucose levels. So if the blood glucose levels get too low, then it could result in you experiencing that bonking sensation, which if you've ever experienced that, you obviously know that it significantly impairs your performance, almost to the point where you slow down to like a walk or a crawl, depending on what the activity is. So consuming carbohydrate regularly during exercise helps keeps the body from drawing into the glycogen stores too quickly. So it doesn't necessarily, when you take in carbohydrate during exercise, the body's not breaking it down and storing it. It's utilizing that glucose that you're putting into your bloodstream first. So it helps minimize the amount of glycogen that your body is eating into during exercise. It's still going to eat into it and use it, but it's just going to use it a lot slower. So you can essentially prolong how long your glycogen stores last by taking in carbohydrate during exercise. And so obviously by keeping fluid levels topped up, by keeping electrolyte levels topped up, and then by keeping carbohydrate stores topped up during exercise to the best of your ability, it'll help optimize your performance. Again, the goal is never to gain weight or take on so much fluid that you start to gain weight, or to take on too many electrolytes, because too many electrolytes compared to fluid intake can have its own set of problems and can eventually result in the opposite of hyponatremia, which is hypernatremia. And then the goal is not to be taking on so many carbohydrates that you're starting to store them as glycogen, or your body's not even beginning to touch glycogen stores, because taking in too many calories and too many carbohydrates at once also can have detrimental effects on the gut. But the goal is to minimize the body's losses so that essentially the body can perform optimally with what you're giving it, right? So it's finding that right balance between too little and too much. And so that's where evidence-based guidelines for fueling come into play, because we have a pretty decent sense of where is a good place to start based on the scientific literature. So for the evidence-based fueling guidelines during endurance activity, like I mentioned before, if it's less than an hour, really fueling doesn't matter too much. The general recommendation here is to have anywhere between 12 and 32 ounces of plain water. If it's relatively cool outside, you might not need to take in much, or you might opt for on the lower end of that range. If it's a really, really, really warm event that's less than an hour, you might drink some, and you might pour some on you just to keep cool. But for the most part, it's still just water. Taking in carbohydrates doesn't matter because the body has plenty of glycogen stores to last for an hour, even if it's an hour like max effort time trial. The body has plenty of glycogen stores and carbohydrates to draw upon for that activity. And then electrolytes don't matter too much either, because it's not long enough for you to really lose enough electrolytes to where it starts to become a problem. But now for events lasting more than an hour, this is where we start to tack on electrolytes and carbohydrates. So the general recommendation for fluids is still the same. It's about 12 to 32 ounces of plain water or fluids per hour. And obviously this is a big range, so I'll talk about how to individualize things a little bit later on. But in general, 12 to 32 ounces of fluids per hour. And typically, I know there's a lot of debate on this still, but the research tends to suggest not relying on thirst as an indicator of when to drink. So there are some people out there that are a proponent of drinking to thirst alone and not having, say, like a set amount of fluids to drink each hour, or having a schedule to stick to. But in general, usually when that sensation of thirst kicks in, especially if it's a really long endurance event, it's almost too late. Your body's starting to get behind on fluid stores, essentially. And so by relying just on thirst, you run the very real risk of not drinking enough and not taking in enough fluids. And you risk dehydrating yourself. Now, this isn't to say that there might not be some individuals out there where this could work. But in general, the generalized evidence-based guidelines suggest not relying on thirst for longer endurance events when it comes to fluid intake. So we have 12 to 32 ounces of water or fluids, and then 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And then when it comes to electrolytes, it's a little bit less clear. There's no evidence-based guideline on necessarily how much to take. Now, I will say it is recommended in the research literature, particularly recommended by the American College of Sports Medicine in the research literature, for athletes to have kind of essentially like a starting place of around 300 to 600 milligrams per hour of sodium during prolonged exercise. So that would be, during training sessions or races that are lasting longer than 60 to 90 minutes. A starting place would be 300 to 600 milligrams per hour. But that being with the caveat that the athlete will need to obviously try and individualize how much sodium they're taking from there, whether it's less or more, based on how much they're losing in their sweat. Now, there are ways of testing sodium losses in sweat. You can go to registered dietitians. That's usually the only place that I know of that'll actually measure sodium losses in sweat. Like I got my sodium sweat loss concentrations measured by a registered dietitian a few years back. I'm sure there are other clinics and other places that do it, but registered dietitians are one professional that I know of that will do something like that. So you can get it physically measured. Usually they'll stimulate sweat production and they'll measure the amount of sodium that's in your sweat. So that's a more objective and valid way of doing it. There are slightly less objective and less valid and reliable ways of doing it, using some online calculators that can help kind of give you a rough estimate of how much sodium you're losing per hour in your sweat. Those are obviously a little bit less accurate, but at least in my own personal experience, I've done both. I've had it measured objectively with a registered dietitian, and then I've also used kind of an online calculator to estimate it, and the results came out to be pretty close to each other. So in my situation, both methods kind of seemed to work for me, and one kind of confirmed the other that was probably how much sodium I was losing in my sweat per hour. And then obviously that amount is going to vary as well based on the conditions and the temperature. So it's not only variable on an individual basis, but it's also extremely variable on a person-to-person basis. So there's not necessarily any evidence-based guidelines yet, or at least any really good concrete evidence-based guidelines when it comes to providing like a specific range of electrolytes, particularly sodium, to consume during endurance activity. But it is just generally recommended that you should take in some amount of electrolytes with your fluids during prolonged endurance events that last over an hour. So just to kind of summarize, if it's less than an hour, it's just 12 to 32 ounces of plain water. Although, again, you can take in electrolytes, you can take in carbohydrates. It's not necessarily going to do you any harm to do so, but you don't necessarily need it. So that's why if it's less than an hour, it's just consuming plain water. If it lasts longer than an hour, the evidence generally suggests still 12 to 32 ounces of water, depending on the individual and the conditions. 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, and that's roughly 240 to 360 calories per hour. And then just consuming some amount of electrolytes. And you'll obviously have to work on individualizing the amount of sodium that you're taking in to suit your individual needs. But consuming the fluids with the carbohydrates with whatever amount of electrolytes you find works best for you, that's generally what's recommended. Now, obviously those recommendations are very general and very broad, and there's some big ranges in there. So when it comes to the ranges, that's where the individualization comes in. And the individualization of it depends on you as the athlete. So some athletes might not sweat as much as others. And so those who don't sweat as much as others might consume less fluids per hour than those who do sweat a lot. Some athletes might not sweat very much, but they might lose a ton of sodium each hour. And so compared to other athletes who might sweat a lot more, maybe don't lose quite as much sodium. So there's just huge differences between athletes. And then the same thing is true also of carbohydrates as well. Although the range of carbohydrates isn't typically quite as big as, say, something like water or just fluids, but there's also some individualization that goes into how many calories you feel best on when doing prolonged endurance activity. And so that's why there's typically a range of 60 to 90 grams per hour. And again, that's just a recommendation, and it's just a very general recommendation. So some really small, lighter athletes might consume less than that. They might get away with being able to take in 45 to 50 grams of carbohydrates an hour, and they feel pretty good on that. Whereas some bigger, heavier athletes might need more, and they might tend to opt for the upper end of that 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate range. And I've even known some people to go slightly over that. Although you don't want to be taking in obviously too many calories per hour because it can tend to overload the gut, which during activity there's obviously less blood flow going to the stomach and the gut, and so you can't process quite as much food as you could if you were doing no activity. So that's why you just have to be careful and not do too much and not take in too much because you run the risk of some GI upset if you're taking in too much. And that goes for fluids as well as carbohydrates. So that's where the individualization comes in. These are just evidence-based guidelines that we have come up with based on the best available literature that's out there. And then it's up to the athlete on an individual basis to kind of tailor their specific fueling strategy to them. But usually when I'm working with athletes, I will start with these evidence-based guidelines and say, here is the best place to start. Find a place within these ranges that works best for you. And the best way of finding out what works best for each athlete is just trial and error in training in particular. So hopefully when you show up to race day, you have gotten at least close to optimizing the fueling strategy that you think is going to work best for you. And then obviously if it doesn't quite work out on race day, then you can go back to the drawing board and start to tweak your fueling strategy a little bit until you do get it right. So sometimes even if you're starting with these evidence-based guidelines, it might not be perfect for a while, and it could take you, months or years of tweaking with it and trying different products and trying different routes of getting in or different methods of getting in carbohydrates and electrolytes before you find what really works. And then again, this also depends too on the conditions. So not only are athletes different in terms of like how much they sweat from one athlete compared to the other, or how much sodium they lose, or how much carbohydrates they need, but it's also very condition dependent as well. So really, really cool races, let's say you're doing an Ironman in a really, really cool environment and it takes you 10 hours to do it, you're not sweating nearly as much as you would be if you did, let's say, an Ironman in a really, really extremely hot and humid condition or environment that takes you 10 and a half to 11 hours. Your fueling intake is going to be vastly different, specifically how much fluid you're taking on and how much electrolyte you're taking on. Carbohydrate intake might not change much depending on the conditions. It might a little bit, but in general, it's usually the fluids and the electrolytes that are going to vary pretty drastically depending on the duration of the event, the conditions of the event, so on and so forth. And so not only do you need to find out what works best for you, but you also need to try and work on finding what works best for you in different conditions. But like I said, starting with those evidence-based recommendations and guidelines and ranges is definitely the place to go, or the place to start. Now, the other aspect of individualizing your fueling plan is to find the specific products or foods that work for you. So some athletes really love Gatorade products and they stick with Gatorade products. Some athletes love Power Bar products and so they might stick with Power Bar products. Some athletes might love Cliff products and use Cliff products. And then there's GU, and there's all these other sorts of different brands and companies out there that make different types of products with different concentrations of carbohydrates to electrolytes. And so you just have to find what works best for you. And so usually what I discourage athletes from doing is trying to copy the exact fueling strategy of another athlete that they view as being successful. So I've worked with athletes before where it's really common, and I've even worked with some athletes that have dialed in a really good nutrition strategy and fueling strategy, and it's worked really well for them. But for whatever reason, they see another athlete that they look up to, whether it's an age grouper or even a pro athlete, and they see that they take a different nutrition product than what they're currently taking. And so then they want to try it out just because they want to emulate that other athlete that they look up to. And I usually highly discourage that, just especially if you found something that works reasonably well for you, because everyone is so different. So professional athletes are all different in between themselves. And if you look at even just amongst professional athletes, obviously some of it comes down to who they're sponsored by, but every single professional athlete has a slightly different fueling strategy. And so, like, for example, Lionel Sanders uses exclusively Gatorade products, at least as far as I know, and he's sponsored by Gatorade, and he tends to do really well on that. Whereas if you look at another professional triathlete, say like Sebastian Kienle, he's sponsored by Power Bar, and so he pretty much does everything using Power Bar. And so like Lionel Sanders will pretty much get the majority of his fluids, carbohydrates, and sodium from drinking Gatorade Endurance. And that's pretty much all he does. And then if you look at someone like Sebastian Kienle, he'll drink Power Bar. He'll have Power Bar powders mixed in with his water. So he'll get some fluids and electrolytes and carbohydrates that way. But then he'll also primarily get his carbohydrates from gels when he's racing in Ironmans. And you could look at a bunch of different pros and they all have different strategies compared to those two. So it's entirely unique, entirely individual. And just because you find one brand or company's products works well for you, it doesn't mean that another company or brand's products is going to work just as well. Because each product is slightly different depending on the company and the brand. So that's where it can be rather overwhelming. Especially for newer athletes who are trying to figure this all out, just because there is so much out there. So many companies, so many brands, so many different types of products. There's gels, there's gummies, there's powders, there's bars. And then should you be doing real food? Should you be doing supplements or like sports products and sports bars? It's extremely confusing. And the general answer is it doesn't really matter what product you choose. What matters is that you start with the evidence-based guidelines, try and find out what works best for you in terms of how much fluid, how much electrolyte, how much carbohydrate, and then you can try and tinker with which brand or company and which product you end up going with. And over time, you'll figure it out if you start with general evidence-based guidelines and kind of work your way out from there. So my top pieces of advice when it comes to finding what works for you is to start with these evidence-based guidelines. So start with the recommended ranges for fluid, carbohydrates, and then obviously electrolytes is a little bit more individual. We don't necessarily have any really good evidence-based guidelines yet for sodium intake. But start with the ranges that we know are supported by evidence, and then try and find the products or the brands or the companies that you like to meet those goals or those ranges of intakes that you're trying to target, and then just tweak and tinker from there. So try and shy away from copying exactly what someone else does, because first of all, you have no idea if it works perfectly for them or not. And even if it does, you're different than another athlete, just like the other athlete you're comparing yourself to is completely different from a different athlete. And so it needs to be very individualized to you, what you like, how much you lose in terms of fluids and electrolytes and how many carbohydrates you need during prolonged activity. So start with these guidelines and then kind of work your way out and try and figure out what exactly works best for you as an individual. But those are the guidelines during activity. So what about before and after? I'm not going to talk too much about what to do before and after outside of what to do, say, like just before activity, and then what to do immediately after. All right, and I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to go too far outside of the window of the time during and just surrounding training. So when it comes to approaching fueling leading up to, say, a training session or a race, obviously exactly what you consume is going to look different depending on if it's a short training session versus a long training session versus a race. It's all going to be slightly different. But in general, you just want to make sure that you are topped up on those three major areas of concern, or those three major nutrients leading into your exercise session. So you want to be topped up on fluids, you want to be topped up on electrolytes, and you want to be topped up on carbohydrates. You don't want to be in the hole or deficient in any of those. So if you're going into a training session dehydrated a little bit, it could potentially affect your performance in that session. If you're going in low on sodium stores, then it could potentially affect that upcoming session you have. And if you go into particularly a really intense training session or race really low on glycogen stores, then it could also potentially affect that session as well. And so it gets rather complex depending on what the training session is, what the goal of the session is, and then if it's a training session versus a race, what the conditions are. There's a variety of factors that would affect exactly what you consume or drink pre-exercise. But in general, you want to make sure that you are drinking sufficiently, obviously, throughout the day, leading up to that training session or in between training sessions, so that you go into that upcoming training session well hydrated. And then you just want to make sure that you go in topped up as well on your carbohydrate stores and electrolyte stores. And usually that just means making sure that you're refueling after training sessions or fueling well throughout the day leading into a training session. Now, there are a few caveats depending on if you're doing a fasted training session for a very specific adaptive response, but I won't even go into that right now in this podcast. So in general, when it comes to approaching training sessions, you just want to make sure that you are essentially topped up on fluids, electrolytes, and carbohydrates. And then when it comes to immediately post-exercise, we have a good amount of evidence to suggest what we should be doing. Again, exactly how you get your fluids and your fuel in after exercise depends on you. You can get in, carbohydrates and proteins and fluids and electrolytes in a variety of different ways. But again, we have some generalized ranges to start with. And so post-exercise, what matters most? It's, again, typically replacing what you lost during exercise and then also giving the body the nutrients it needs to help support the adaptation or recovery process from whatever the session was that you just did. Again, this might look different depending on the type of training session, how intense the training session was, how long it was, whether it was a training session or a race. But in general, you want to make sure that you're just keeping your fluids, electrolytes, carbohydrate stores topped up afterwards. And then you're also giving yourself some protein as well, which is a slightly new addition, to make sure that you're fueling recovery and getting that recovery started in an optimal manner once the training session or the race is done. So when it comes to fluids, it's typically recommended that you drink 16 to 24 ounces of fluid for each pound of body weight that you lost during exercise. If you're not necessarily weighing yourself before and after every single exercise session, which I don't necessarily recommend because it's kind of annoying and kind of tedious to remember to weigh yourself before and after every session, you can just kind of drink to thirst, or just make sure that you're drinking at least 16 to 24 ounces of fluid within the first hour or so after exercise, and then continue drinking throughout there. In general, the goal is to make sure that you're back to your pre-exercise body weight within a few hours after exercise. So if you go into an exercise session and you're 150 pounds and you come out 144 pounds, you don't want to just not be drinking any, or at least the weight that you lost is mostly fluid, right? And so the goal wouldn't be to count that as weight loss. That is weight loss that you want to recover. And so usually it's fluids. So you just want to make sure that you're drinking enough fluids to get back to your normal pre-exercise or training session or pre-race weight. But in general, it is recommended 16 to 24 ounces of fluid for each pound of body weight lost during exercise. And then it's also recommended too, based on the literature, to have a meal or snack within 60 minutes of the training session or race. And in general, the goal is to consume a combination of carbohydrates and protein, roughly. And again, this obviously depends on the length of the training session, the intensity of it. But let's just say it's kind of like a standard training session that's anywhere from 30 minutes to a few hours, aiming to get in somewhere around 80 grams of carbohydrates alongside 20 grams of protein immediately after the training session is a pretty good practice to fall into. But in general, as long as you're replacing the fluids that you lost during exercise and then you're getting in some kind of meal or snack after an exercise bout that contains both carbohydrates and protein, you're going to be setting yourself up to recover optimally and adapt optimally from that training session. And then that's just immediately post-exercise. Obviously, fueling still matters beyond that kind of post-exercise, like 30 to 60 minute window. But like I said, I'm not going to dive too deep into like how much carbohydrate, protein, and fat you need over the course of a whole day, how much fluids you need over the course of a whole day. We're just going to stick to the window that is just immediately surrounding training. And so, again, just to kind of recap everything that I've talked about so far, leading up to a training session or a race, the goal is to make sure that you're sufficiently topped up on your fluids, electrolytes, carbohydrates. When it comes to during exercise, if it's less than an hour, usually just plain water will do, anywhere between 12 and 32 ounces of plain water. But remember, if it's less than an hour, fueling intake isn't as important, especially electrolytes and carbohydrates. It's really unimportant if it's less than an hour in duration. Anything that's longer than, say, 60 to 90 minutes in duration, now electrolytes and carbohydrates becomes more important. And so the general evidence-based guidelines when it comes to fueling during an exercise bout that's longer than an hour is 12 to 32 ounces of fluids. Not relying on thirst as an indicator, but sticking more to some sort of schedule or set plan of taking in fluids at a regular interval. Consuming 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. That's roughly 240 to 360 calories per hour. And then making sure that you're taking in some amount of electrolytes alongside the fluids and carbohydrates that you're consuming. And then when it comes to immediately post-exercise, so kind of within that like 30 to 60 minute window after exercise, making sure that you're again getting back to your normal level of hydration, your normal level of electrolyte balance, and then making sure that your glycogen stores are topped up after exercise as well, because you'll have your body will have started to tap into some of those glycogen stores. So it's just getting you back to normal essentially after. And that usually consists of making sure that you're drinking 16 to 24 ounces of fluids for each pound of body weight loss during exercise. And then having some sort of meal or snack within roughly 60 minutes of training that consists of carbohydrates and protein. And usually about 80 grams of carbohydrates and 20 grams of protein should be enough to make sure that you're getting that recovery process started optimally. And those are the general evidence-based guidelines for fueling during endurance activity. So in the show notes of this podcast, I'm going to include a PDF document. It's going to be a one-page PDF document. It's going to cover a lot of what I talked about in some succinct bullet points. And then I'll have a table in there as well that includes those evidence-based sports nutrition guidelines for fueling during training and racing. It'll touch on immediately pre-exercise, during exercise, and then immediately post-exercise. So all the guidelines and recommendations that I talked about will be included within that document, as well as the importance of hydration, fluids, electrolytes, and carbohydrates. And then I'm also going to include some of the references and sources that I've used to come up with the discussion for this podcast and where these evidence-based guidelines come from. There's two sources or readings in particular that I would recommend that you look at, especially if you want to learn more about sports nutrition and fueling not only during exercise, but also throughout the day. A good place to start is a position stand that was put out in 2016 by the American College of Sports Medicine, along with the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics of Canada. And now usually the American College of Sport Medicine will come out with these position stands every few years on a variety of different topics. And so the last one that they came out with as it related specifically to sports nutrition and human performance was in 2016. It's a really great resource because it's essentially a massive summary of the available research literature that we have related to sports nutrition and human performance. So within the position stand, they talk not only about generalized fueling throughout the day, so like how much fat, carbohydrate, protein is recommended for athletes depending on how active they are and how much training they do each week. It'll talk about that, but it'll also talk about the fueling strategies during training and racing and during endurance activity, which is where these guidelines come from that I'm talking about. And then another great reading or resource that I've put in there as well is another literature review from 2019 that talks about not only nutrition for endurance athletes in particular, but also the evidence surrounding different supplements and which supplements have evidence to support their efficacy, specifically as it relates to endurance performance. So I'll be sure to link in those two readings or sources as well. And that's where I've gotten all this stuff from. So those are obviously the sources for the information that you're hearing in this podcast as well. So I will be sure to include that in the show notes for you so you can go in there and you can have kind of a quick reference guide for the recommendations and the evidence-based guidelines that I touched on in this podcast. But you can also dive more deeply into sports nutrition and the evidence surrounding sports nutrition principles as a whole within those additional readings that I've recommended in that PDF document. So hopefully this was useful for you as an endurance athlete, especially when we're in the midst of summer months in the Northern Hemisphere, and the importance of just fueling in general can't be overstated enough. So again, I hope that you enjoyed this podcast. And as always, if you have any questions on the topics that I discuss within these podcast episodes, you can feel free to reach out to me at peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com, or you can go to www.peakenduranceSolutions.com and send me a message through our website. Thanks again for tuning in, and hopefully you will join me again for the next episode. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you liked what you heard in today's episode, please feel free to leave us a review. Those reviews are greatly appreciated and help spread the word about our podcast, as well as help us improve the content that we deliver to our listeners. And then finally, if you know of anyone who would be interested in listening to our podcast, please go ahead and share our podcast with them.